Dr. Mueller, I want to close out my questions, turn to some of the exchange you had with Mr. Welsh a bit earlier. I'd like to see if we can broaden the aperture at the end of the hearing. From your testimony today, I gather that you believe that knowingly accepting foreign assistance during a presidential campaign is an unethical thing to do.
And a crime.
And a crime.
Circumstances, yes.
And to the degree,
and a crime given certain circumstances.
And to the degree that it undermines our democracy and our institutions, we can agree that it's also unpatriotic.
True.
And wrong.
True.
The standard of behavior for a presidential candidate, or any candidate for that matter, shouldn't be merely whether something is criminal. There should be held to a higher standard. You would agree?
Yeah, I will not get into that because it goes to the standards to be applied by other institutions besides ours.
Well, I'm just referring to ethical standards. We should hold our elected officials to a standard higher than mere avoidance of criminality, shouldn't we?
Absolutely.
You have served this country for decades. You've taken an oath to defend the Constitution. You hold yourself to a standard of doing what's right.
I would hope.
You have. I think we can all see that. And befitting the times, I'm sure your reward will be unending criticism. But we are grateful. The need to act in an ethical manner is not just a moral one, but when people act unethically, it also exposes them to compromise, particularly in dealing with foreign powers. Is that true?
True.
Because when someone acts unethically in connection with a foreign partner, that foreign partner can later expose their wrongdoing and extort them.
True.
And that conduct, that unethical conduct, can be of a financial nature if you have a financial motive or an illicit business dealing. Am I right?
Yes.
But it can also just involve deception. If you are lying about something that can be exposed, then you can be blackmailed.
Also true.
In the case of Michael Flynn, he was secretly doing business with Turkey, correct?
Yes.
And that could open him up to compromise that financial relationship.
I presume.
He also lied about his discussions with the Russian ambassador. And since the Russians were on the other side of that conversation, they could have exposed that, could they not?
Yes.
If a presidential candidate was doing business in Russia and saying he wasn't, Russians could expose that too, could they not?
I leave that to you.
Well, let's look at Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, someone that the Trump organization was in contact with to make that deal happen. Your report indicates that Michael Cohen had a long conversation on the phone with someone from Dmitry Peskov's office. Presumably the Russians could record that conversation, could they not?
Yes.
And so if candidate Trump was saying, I have no dealings with the Russians, but the Russians had a tape recording, they could expose that, could they not?
Yes.
That's the stuff of counterintelligence nightmares, is it not?
Well, it has to do with counterintelligence and the need for a strong counterintelligence entity.
It does indeed. And when this was revealed that there were these communications, notwithstanding the president's denials, the president was confronted about this, and he said two things. First of all, that's not a crime. But I think you and I have already agreed that that shouldn't be the standard, right, Mr. Mueller?
True.
And the second thing he said was, why should I miss out on all those opportunities? I mean, why indeed? Merely running a presidential campaign, why should you miss out on making all that money? Was the import of his statement. Were you ever able to ascertain whether Donald Trump still intends to build that tower when he leaves office?
Is that a question, sir?
Yes, were you able to ascertain, because he wouldn't answer your questions completely, whether or if he ever ended that desire to build that tower?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
If the president was concerned that if he lost his election, he didn't want to miss out on that money, might he have the same concern about losing his reelection and missing out on that money?
Speculation.
The difficulty with this, of course, is we are all left to wonder whether the president is representing us or his financial interests. That concludes my questions. Mr. Nunes, do you have any concluding remarks? Director Mueller, let me close by returning to where I began. Thank you for your service, and thank you for leading this investigation. The facts you set out in your report and have elucidated here today tell a disturbing tale of a massive Russian intervention in our election, of a campaign so eager to win, so driven by greed that it was willing to accept the help of a hostile foreign power in a presidential election decided by a handful of votes in a few key states. Your work tells of a campaign so determined to conceal their corrupt use of foreign help that they risk going to jail by lying to you, to the FBI, and to Congress about it, and indeed, some have gone to jail over such lies. And your work speaks of a president who committed countless acts of obstruction of justice that, in my opinion, and that of many other prosecutors, had it been anyone else in the country, they would have been indicted. Notwithstanding the many things you have addressed today and in your report, there were some questions you could not answer given the constraints you're operating under. You would not tell us whether you would have indicted the president but for the OLC opinion that you could not. And so the Justice Department will have to make that decision when the president leaves office, both as to the crime of obstruction of justice and as to the campaign finance fraud scheme that individual one directed and coordinated and for which Michael Cohen went to jail. You would not tell us whether the president should be impeached, nor did we ask you, since it is our responsibility to determine the proper remedy for the conduct outlined in your report. Whether we decide to impeach the president in the House or we do not, we must take any action necessary to protect the country while he is in office. You would not tell us the results or whether other bodies looked into Russian compromise in the form of money laundering, so we must do so. You would not tell us whether the counterintelligence investigation revealed whether people still serving within the administration pose a risk of compromise and should never have been given a security clearance, so we must find out. We did not bother to ask whether financial inducements from any Gulf nations were influencing U.S. policy, since it is outside the four corners of your report, and so we must find out. But one thing is clear from your report, your testimony, from Director Wray's statements yesterday. The Russians massively intervened in 2016, and they are prepared to do so again in voting that is set to begin a mere 8 months from now. The president seems to welcome the help again, and so we must make all efforts to harden our elections infrastructure, to ensure there is a paper trail for all voting, to deter the Russians from meddling, to discover it when they do, to disrupt it, and to make them pay. Protecting the sanctity of our elections begins, however, with the recognition that accepting foreign help is disloyal to our country, unethical, and wrong. We cannot control what the Russians do, not completely, but we can decide what we do. And that this centuries-old experiment we call American democracy is worth cherishing. Director Mueller, thank you again for being here today. And before I adjourn, I would like to excuse you and Mr. Zebley. Everyone else, please remain seated.